But I kept seeing in the sidebar on YouTube, I kept seeing recommended videos for 9/11 truth kind of stuff, and I rolled my eyes because I didn't believe everything I was told, and JFK wasn't killed by a lone assassin and things like this. But 9/11, that's kind of crazy conspiracy stuff. But I would click on it out of curiosity here and there, and some of it would be total nonsense about flying orbs and whatever. Some of it would be kind of intriguing, and it would raise a point about Osama bin Laden being in hospital in Rawalpindi the night before 9/11, and really? Is that true? And I'd look it up, and that is true. And or Operation Northwoods, what's that? And I'd look it up, and that's a real thing that really happened. So that was kind of my gateway into starting to think about this, and I started researching more and more, and that got the ball rolling, and suddenly I was looking at the Federal Reserve and all this stuff, and eventually the penny just dropped, and okay, everything is different than what I thought it was. I have to do something about this.
I'm here with James Corbett, independent journalist and publisher of the Corbett Report. Thank you for coming on. I'm not going to shake your hand again. Just for the audience, we died, so we're pretending to have this conversation new, and we literally just had it like 45 seconds ago. But the first question I did ask is I pulled a page out of Jeff Berwick's playbook. I said, how did you become an anarchist? How did you get into this space?
And my answer is that I essentially would say logic and time got me there. Because like a lot of people, I started encountering the philosophy of liberty. In fact, through the video, The Philosophy of Liberty, which I know maybe some people don't know, but I remember seeing that video and starting to think about some of these ideas about self-ownership and, well, what does this mean? And okay, so I guess the government maybe doesn't necessarily own the people and be able to have the right to rule over them, but we need government for some things, and I wrestled with that for years before I finally got all the way towards being an anarchist. So it was just a slow process of conversion and that's the way I imagine for a lot of people. You're confronted by the idea, and it doesn't happen overnight for most people. It takes time and reason, but people will get there.
Listen, I mean, the reason why I'm interested in asking people that is because, my personal story, I considered myself like a liberal progressive at a certain point. I was in the military for 4 years. I completely bought it, drank the Kool-Aid with it, and really didn't even question it wasn't really until I guess relatively recently, like 4 years or so, that I've actually kind of made this shift. So I'm always curious as to how, because then you get some people that are just like, I've been an anarchist since I was born. I hated my teachers and I hated authority, and I just had to, which is great. I mean, if you can be that wise.
If you're born free and hold on to it, that's great.
God
but
bless.
A lot of people aren't like that.
Right. And again, the second question I'm going to ask you that we're going to have to pretend like I didn't just ask is, how were you as a kid? Like, what kind of kid were you? You were naturally did you naturally question authority? Were you naturally kind of like precocious in that sense?
I was not in the typical sense of anti-authoritarianism. I was a good boy and a good student in a lot of ways, and I certainly got good grades. But I was the type that would question the teacher and intelligently question the teacher, and sometimes correct them when they were mistaken. And sometimes, one story that springs to mind for some reason, when I was in 4th grade, I remember the teacher it was a science class, and we were doing a thought experiment, and I can't remember the exact experiment, but it was something about this object. Do you think it will float or sink when we put it in the water? Something like that. And I said, I think it'll float, or whatever the answer was. And eventually, the class took a vote, who thinks it'll float, who thinks it'll sink. The teacher gives the answer, you're right, it will float. And after we got the right answer, I started thinking about the reasons why the right answer might have been the wrong answer, and I started arguing with the teacher, but maybe it should sink because of da-da-da-da-da, and but doesn't that mean that? And eventually he explained it to me in the different objections I had, but I found it, in retrospect, I find it interesting that I found myself arguing against the right answer, even when I was on the right winning team and I had the right answer and I was being told by the authority figure I was right. That's, I think, when most people would stop, but I still wanted to question what I was being told until I really understood it.
So you weren't happy with just a pat on the head?
Yeah.
So, how was that received as a kid? Did you kind of get any pushback for that? Or?
No, and I know that's really my luck, because I know there are people who have terrible experiences in schools, a bad teacher or a bad school or whatever it is. I was really blessed as a young kid to generally have, if not good teachers, at least teachers that weren't going to take me to the wall because I questioned their authority or things like that. I mean, I've generally been encouraged in that, and I think that was incredibly important for me as a youngster.
I can honestly say the same thing. I can honestly say, despite my trepidations about the public school system, I had encountered some really amazing teachers that truly fostered free thinking. It might not have been my opinions may not have been their opinions, and most of the time I would venture that it wasn't.
Yeah.
But that being said, I was never I never remember having too much pushback on actually expressing a view or something like that in school, because I was always the one raising my hand and challenging the teacher or questioning something.
Right.
But to kind of segue into your work as a journalist, how long have you been actually podcasting and reporting?
So I've been doing this since 2007.
Okay.
I started in 2007 when I was 27 years old. And at the time, of course, I was working a regular full-time job and then coming home and doing it at night. So I just didn't sleep for the first few years of the website, essentially. And then it was 2011 that I actually took the plunge and went into it full-time. And so I've been working full-time as a podcaster for the last 9 years. Does that exist? Apparently it does.
I mean, and God bless.
Yeah. Thank you to all the subscribers, because that's really how I do it.
In all honesty, we need more people that are able to sustain themselves in this way. So when you first got into this realm of journalism, was there a catalyst for it? Was there an event or something that you said, I have to get the truth out there on this issue?
Well, I mean, I could extend it back and try to find out how far it goes. But
tell me about your mother. No,
yeah, I'll tell you about my great grandfather. No, the immediate trigger, I think, would be 9/11, which I was getting into in 2006. It was 2006, and the story I've told many times, so if my audience is watching this, you can fast forward. But essentially, I was in Japan, moving to a new apartment in Japan, and this apartment came with an internet connection. It was the first time in a few years I'd had an internet connection in my home since I left my parents' home. So I had been going to internet cafes to get check email and whatever, but I hadn't had access to the internet really for a few years. And so coming back online, kind of, so to speak, in 2006, and suddenly there were these things like video sharing platforms, YouTube, Google Video. These things had just sprung up, and so it was all new to me, and I was, wow, this is crazy. And so I thought, this is great. I'm interested in documentaries. I'm interested in politics and things like this. So I started just watching all sorts of things, documentaries, the Daily Show and Colbert Report, and mainstream kind of stuff. But I kept seeing in the sidebar on YouTube, I kept seeing recommended videos for 9/11 truth kind of stuff, and I rolled my eyes because I didn't believe everything I was told, and JFK wasn't killed by a lone assassin and things like this. But 9/11, that's kind of crazy conspiracy stuff. But I would click on it out of curiosity here and there, and some of it would be total nonsense about flying orbs and whatever. Some of it would be kind of intriguing, and it would raise a point about Osama bin Laden being in hospital in Rawalpindi the night before 9/11, and really, is that true? And I'd look it up, and that is true. And or Operation Northwoods, what's that? And I'd look it up, and that's a real thing that really happened. So that was kind of my gateway into starting to think about this, and I started researching more and more, and that got the ball rolling, and suddenly I was looking at the Federal Reserve and all this stuff, and eventually the penny just dropped, and okay, everything is different than what I thought it was. I have to do something about this. My immediate initial thought was, I gotta start, I don't know, physically going around and handing out CDs of audio or documentaries or something to people, but I'm in Japan, no one speaks English anyway, this is stupid, like what am I gonna do? So, it's the internet age, I'll start a website, I guess, a podcast. Okay, I'll start a podcast. And that was really the impetus. I am not a very spontaneous guy in a lot of ways, but for this one, it was a snowball. Within 6 months, basically, my life had completely changed. And I was starting a website, which I had never imagined I was going to do.
Now, do you remember what video it was that actually kind of turned you?
I wish I could. I really don't.
I know Loose Change is one that this the famous one.
Yeah,
it wasn't.
That wasn't the first one I saw, and it wasn't one of the most formative. I remember one of the ones where it was kind of like, okay, there's clearly much more here than I ever knew, was The Money Masters, which was like a 3.5-hour documentary, I think, about the Federal Reserve and banking system in the U.S. That it was because I was at the point where I was clearly convinced, okay, 9/11 was clearly not what the government told us, but how does that work, and what does this function? Where does the power for this come from, and how could they do this? And when I started to learn about the controlled nature of the monetary system itself, I started to realize, it's much deeper and much bigger than just 9/11, and I think that's where I started to branch out. So that's a formative video for me in terms of becoming an anarchist. There was a video called The Philosophy of Liberty, which I remember seeing years and years and years ago, and that was one of the first penny drop moments for me that probably led towards my path of becoming an anarchist.
Okay, so, for some people, I guess different people approach it for different reasons, or different things are what convinced them. So, I'm more of a nuts and bolts political, once I started seeing the pieces not really fitting together in terms of efficacy, that's when I started kind of more looking into the moral implications of voluntarism versus statism and things of that nature. What was it for you? Was it my question basically is this: are you familiar with Thomas Sowell? Obviously, the economist.
Oh yeah, of course.
Thomas Sowell famously says that he went to the Chicago School of Economics and studied under Milton Friedman and remained an ardent Marxist socialist. He spent one summer interning for the government, I think it was the VA, and that's what turned him into he's not an anarchist, I guess you could consider conservative, but that being said, someone who doesn't buy into the Kool-Aid in terms of the government is the solution to all of our problems. And he said that's when I realized that the government is actually incapable of doing almost all of the things they claim to they're going to be able to do. Was it something like that, or was it the I guess the moral implications? You get a Larkin Rose type who's he's adamant, and his passions are more in the ethical nature of being an anarchist versus being a statist, and someone who uses coercion to get what they want versus someone who doesn't. So that's kind of my question. Where do you fall?
For me, it is absolutely not the consequentialist argument that I use or that convinced me or that I respond with. For me, it is definitely the moral argument. I mean, there is a utilitarian argument to be made, and I understand that. And yes, I think that things will actually run better when there is not a central planning entity trying to control everybody's individual plans. The world will work better under spontaneous order. Don't worry, I'm a professional podcaster. It will work better under spontaneous order, but that's not the reason, ultimately. It is because it is immoral, truly immoral, to impose your individual will on others against their consent. To inflict aggression on peaceful people is wrong. And it ultimately doesn't matter if the world is not going to be as efficient. It would be so much more efficient if we could just aggress and violate peaceful people's rights. No, that's not the argument that I mean,
we could just be a Borg hive consciousness and be super efficient. I mean, that's not exactly the world I would like to live in.
Yeah, if we're totally controlled by the government in every way, at every moment of our lives, and social credit and 24/7 surveillance, maybe things could work a little bit better in this or that area of the economy or whatever it is. I'm not interested in that argument.
Okay, that's fair. I know you live in Japan. What is the consciousness on these kind of topics in Japan? Because I feel like most of our audiences are Western audiences. So I'm not really sure how things like this are viewed in Japan. I know Japan is again, the stereotype is a very hierarchical culture. They kind of accept a lot of these hierarchical institutions. I know the conviction rate is something like 98% or something like that if you're charged with a crime. So is that something that people kind of are reacting against, or is it they kind of just take it at face value? How would you describe it?
Well, okay, everywhere you go, people are people. They all have different ideas and opinions and ways of living in the world, but there is the kind of cultural background which you're working in. And at least in the U.S., there is a cultural and historical background of the idea of freedom and personal liberty and
the rugged individual.
Exactly. We rose up to fight off the tyrant and create a new way of doing things. There's at least that idea, and of course, it's never been lived up to, really. But at least people have that to draw on. In Japan, they don't have that to draw on. It has been a complete history of rule by emperors and or shoguns and or, I mean, there's always been a very entrenched ruling class that has told people how to live and enforced it rigidly. And the Japanese people have largely gone along with it, which creates a stable and safe society in a lot of ways. But is stability and safety the be-all and end-all? I would argue no. So the cultural background is very much like these ideas that we're talking about are light years away from anything that's being discussed in sort of mainstream Japanese culture. I know there are pockets of free thinkers and individuals who do not accept that. And actually, even just looking at sort of the mainstream conversation, you can see, even going back a few decades, I mean, they had communists marching on the streets and things in Japan, and violent, repression by the police, and things that are impossible for me to even imagine happening today in the current Japanese political climate, because
Really?
it's so, I mean, mass protests and things is just so not Japanese. I can't believe that happened. But I mean, it's gone through an incredible history, obviously, over the past century or so. So
you would say the culture has been a little bit more, I guess, ossified in its thinking?
I guess so, because I'm trying to think of mass protests and revolution and violence and things that used to happen, but clearly do not happen now. So there's been some changes. But there is a quote that I think MacArthur said during the American administration of Japan post-World War II, where he said, Japan is a nation of children. And sadly, that is kind of true. Their mass propaganda and indoctrination is quite simple and straightforward, and they use cute, colorful cartoon characters to tell you what to do or not to do, and people largely go along with it. And I don't think it's necessarily because they believe it or whatever, it's just because, oh, this is what we're doing now, so let's do it.
So there's no, I mean, I'd say there's always a little bit of everything, but there's no, I guess, more mainstream, I guess, libertarian or freedom movement in Japan. I mean, obviously, we're a little bit on the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of considering ourselves anarchists or voluntarists, but I mean, there's obviously degrees within that, and there's not like a Ron Paul type figure.
There
Japan
have been things that I've brushed up against. I'm not deeply involved with them, but I know there's a Japanese kind of Mises contingent and people who've translated, Hayek and Mises and people into Japanese, and there's been there was the I think it was called the Tokyo Tea Party or something. It was trying to start some sort of political movement around liberty ideas, more or less, in Japan. It's certainly not mainstream, but I know it exists in pockets anyway.
Okay, fair. I mean, I guess, a country of, what do they have, 200 million people in Japan? Or?
I think it's 120 or so.
Okay, I'm a little off.
And shrinking, by the way.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to touch on. I mean, and by the way, for anyone who hasn't seen it, I haven't got a chance to watch it yet either, but there's one of James's most recent interviews discusses this and the demographic crunch in Japan, but it's kind of indicative of a lot of countries. A lot of, I mean, even though Japan's not a Western country, a lot of Western countries are experiencing
developed countries.
If developed countries, a great way to put it, are experiencing similar phenomenon. Could you explain that just briefly, like what exactly is going on demographically in Japan and what that, the implications of that trend is?
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to me that people still don't really see this, but it's because we've been indoctrinated so much with the overpopulation propaganda our entire lives. There's too many people on the planet, they're a cancer, and they're going to overpopulate. And that's been the narrative, and it certainly has made sense if you look at the exponential growth of population over the past century. And if you extend this out forever, oh my God, we're going to be 100 trillion people in a few years, or whatever the propaganda has had it. My son has grown so much in the last year, from 1 to 2. If we extend this out, he'll be 50 feet tall by the time he's 20. It's that kind of thinking, right? I mean, it's nonsense. But what we are facing now is the exact opposite, which is a demographic crunch. Demographic winter is what it's sometimes called, which is, as you say, in country after country, throughout the developed world, throughout much of the underdeveloped world at this point, with sub-Saharan Africa being a notable exception, but a lot of other places on the planet almost universally have birth rates that are now below the replacement rate of 2.1, sometimes substantially below the replacement rate. I don't know the exact number in Japan right now, but it's probably 1.3 or thereabouts, which is exceptionally low. And that means Japan actually has a shrinking population now. For the last few years, more people have been dying than being born in Japan. Adult diapers are outselling baby diapers at this point. Schools are starting to empty out as there are less and less people. They're starting to flirt with ideas of actually letting in more foreign workers into the country, but it's still a very ethnically homogenous population, and people don't want immigrants in the country. It's a very conservative population, so there's still a lot of discussion around that, but it's clearly that's the way the politicians are trying to push it. And this is all dealing with this question of what will happen when we actually start. I mean, it's already started, but when it really starts shrinking, and that's coming.
Well, my follow-up to that is kind of twofold. The first being, what are some of the cultural ramifications that you've witnessed because of that? I guess you could start with that first. And how has this affected the society?
Yeah, as I talked about in my video, I think one of it was kind of strange because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I know that it's happening, and you kind of read about the numbers and economic statistics and things, and it becomes quite theoretical. But the way I actually physically saw it manifest in my reality was going. I have this routine. I'm writing my newsletter on Friday nights. I go to a cafe, get some coffee, and just write my newsletter. And I was going to this one cafe. It was open till midnight, so I could get some work done. After the family goes to bed, I'll go out and just get some work done. But the cafe suddenly was closed at 10 p.m. I'm like, what's going on? You know, what's happening? So I go to another cafe that I knew that was nearby, open till midnight. Now it was closed at 11. I went to somewhere else. It was closing earlier too. I had no idea what is happening. Is this some kind of conspiracy? What's going on? But actually, what I discovered was like 7-Eleven and other convenience stores, the franchises they operate, they obligate the franchise owners to be 24/7. But a lot of the franchise owners are saying we can't afford any workers anymore. There's not enough workers for us to keep our stores open 24/7. Can we break the agreement? And so 7-Eleven and other convenience stores are now starting to ease off and allow, they're testing the idea of closing stores at night and things like this because there literally aren't enough workers for it. And that's one of the things that I started to notice, like, oh, this is real. This is happening. There's something really profound going on. And then you see the weird ways that it plays out. Like there's this video that came out last year of this robotic priest at some Buddhist shrine or something in Japan, where you see all these, Buddhists praying to this robotic priest. That it made me realize that one of the ways that this changeover is going to manifest is towards the technocratic society. And of course, in Japan, robots and whatever, that kind of thing. And the normalization of that is going to be spearheaded by Japan to the point where, of course, who's going to care for the elderly? We don't have enough nurses and doctors. It'll be robots and things like that. So there's going to be profound cultural implications for this, and I think Japan's kind of the test bed for it.
Now, and I asked this question not just specific to Japan, but also this wider trend.
Yeah.
Why?
That's a very good question. There are a number of reasons for that. One that's easy to understand, I think, is economics. The economic vibrancy of the past, which has allowed one person to earn enough for an entire family and have a house in the suburbs and vacation every year, does not exist anymore, obviously. You have two-parent working households.
Is Japan the same way?
Very much so, yeah. It's definitely declining living standard in the sense that, you cannot function without it's very difficult to function without a two-parent working household at this point. People just don't feel economically safe enough to have children. I think that's true in Japan and elsewhere. It's becoming more and more difficult. There are other reasons as well. There are, of course, I'm a conspiracy theorist, so I look at the record of people talking for years and years about the how we could use the injections and injunctions to reduce the population and curtail their ability to populate. Or Charles Galton Darwin, I always get this wrong. Charles Galton Darwin or Charles Darwin Galton? Grandson of Charles Darwin, who wrote about the next million years, where he talked about, it takes a million years for a species to evolve in a certain way, but with science, we can do this in a matter of generations. And if we just have the right injections and the right diet, and we put things into the water supply, we can control people in a much more efficient manner. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know it, every time, for example, out of all the different ways they could engineer plastics, they choose something like BPA, which was known as an estrogen-mimicking compound for years before they decided to put
Alex Jones.
I'm just saying, they put it in everything, the liners of tin cans and everything. And then decades later, half a century later, they go, oh, look at this. This estrogen mimicker seems to be disrupting people's endocrine systems. I don't know what's going on. Yes, they did know what was going on. So.
Okay, and what's the end game? What is the, like, why do they want effeminized societies, or I don't know, at least societies with lower testosterone levels,
or at least an infertile society.
Why do they want these shrinking demographics? What is the purpose of that?
I think one of the important ideologies to get your mind around this idea is eugenics. It was coined in the late 19th century, again, actually by a cousin of Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, who talked about essentially creating a better humanity by weeding out the undesirables from the gene pool. And people will talk about eugenics versus dysgenics. No, eugenics is about getting better people to have more children. Dysgenics is about killing off the people we don't like, but we don't talk about that too much. Well, of course, dysgenics was very much in vogue. For the first few decades of the 20th century, it's impossible to overstate how popular this idea was. Presidents and
Woodrow Wilson was a eugenicist.
Teddy Roosevelt and everyone who was anyone at that time was a eugenicist, and an avowed one. We want to reduce the undesirable population, which sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Isn't that what we want to do? So what did they do? They put in all these involuntary sterilization laws and things like that. But then, eugenics kind of got mixed in with Hitler and the Nazis, and people didn't want that so much. Okay, so we won't do that anymore. But all of the eugenics money and institutions just changed their names, literally changed their names. Eugenics Quarterly became the social biology or whatever they called it after that. The Eugenics Council in America, or the Eugenics Society, literally shared offices with and then just basically merged into the Overpopulation Council, sponsored by John D. Rockefeller III, of course. So it all of the money and all of the funding just shifted over from eugenics to overpopulation. We've got to control the population, and there's a double meaning there, isn't there? I mean, control the population as in make sure there's fewer people, and also control the population. And that has been the sort of a guiding ideology for people with resources and time and energy and ability to enact this type of population control. That's what is happening. It's literally manifesting. We're seeing it happen. The population is reducing exactly as they have talked about, as they wanted, as they wrote about, as they've funded for many, many decades. And people are wondering why it's happening. No, that's exactly because they've told you in many documents that they've written.
That is what I find the most interesting is that a lot of these theories that people claim are conspiratorial, I mean, at the very least, have been penned out by very serious people. Some oftentimes decades before, you're actually seeing the
exactly right. No, that's exactly right. Of course, conspiracy theory is just a thought-stopping term that was invented specifically to stop people from questioning. Pushed by the CIA in the wake of the JFK assassination and the Warren Report. You can read the memo. I can never remember. I think it's 1095-133. Luke Radowski can let me know if that's right or not.
Yeah, what's the memo, bro?
1095-133?
Yes, that's the particular one about... crap, I wasn't thinking.
Okay. Anyway, I can't get the reference right now, but people can look it up. And they can read it for themselves. The CIA embedded that term as a way to stop people from questioning the Warren Report, because how can we, of course, the CIA involved with the JFK assassination, that's a load of rich creamery butter, and let's appoint Alan Dulles to be a leading member of the Warren Commission. Just nonsense. But so, of course, people stop it, and what it does, it prevents people from looking at even source documents, which is insanity, because that's where we get information. So let me if there is anyone in the audience for whom what I'm saying is total babble or gobbledygook or the total woo, they don't believe it, CorbettReport.com/bigoil, BIGOIL, is my How Big Oil and Why Big Oil Conquered the World documentary, It's an hour and a half, 2 hours altogether, something like that. And everything that I say in there is not only transcribed, but hyperlinked back to the original source documents that I'm talking about, where you can read about the eugenics agenda and ultimately the technocratic agenda, which is where we're heading in the future, for complete control over everything. Everything you do, everything you say, everything you breathe is going to be controlled down to the most minute detail. And now that is actually technologically possible. It's happening. They've written about it for decades. It's actually coming true in the way that they talked about, and people say conspiracy theory.
Well, that's why something like the creature from Jekyll Island is so powerful, because I mean, that book uses the words of the founders of the Federal Reserve System, of fractional reserve banking. It actually uses their memorandums, their personal conversations, which describes their goals.
And in fact, actually, I did my Federal Reserve documentary, Century of Enslavement. One of the best pieces of feedback I ever got about that was, I remember someone befuddled in the YouTube comments saying, but this is mostly just Federal Reserve videos and propaganda and stuff. And I'm like, yep, this is their words. They're explaining the heist and the trick of all of this to you. I'm not making this up. They're actually admitting it. You just have to put those pieces together.
And even in terms of one world government or the degradation of national sovereignty. I mean, I guess as anarchist, that's like a weird position to have.
I don't care about national sovereignty.
No, but that being said, something like the European Union. And I'm not going. I can't recall the actual name of the figure. It was some European aristocrat who actually was, I think, half Japanese, who was one of the founders of what eventually became the European Union. I mean, I think it started out as a union between coal companies or something like that, but
it was a trade deal.
But the philosophy behind it was pretty explicit in terms of the desire to create a monoculture, like a European monoculture that can kind of be more easily controlled and manipulated. I mean, obviously they frame it in a way that seems benign or beneficial.
Of course.
I mean, to be fair,
great.
I think some of them actually believe it.
Oh, I don't doubt that most of them actually believe it. I think very few. This is actually something that G. Edward Griffin talked about in a lecture that he delivered under the title of the Quigley Formula, I think. Anyway, he talked about this idea that secret societies are structured so that only people in the very, very core of the secret society actually know what the ultimate plan is and what this is about. Most of the people who are working for an organization, they're given, this is what we're doing, and this is what's happening, and this is why it's happening, and that is enough of a motivation for them, as well as probably monetary motivation. But it can very much function that way. You don't need to control every single person who works for the New York Times in order to control the narrative that will be pumped in the New York Times. You just have to have access to the right editor or the right money man, and things tend to happen.
Absolutely. I kind of the shift over to Europe for just a moment. I mentioned the European Union. You just mentioned you're not interested in national sovereignty. How I define nation, I define it more in its literal term. I think nation's a group of people that identify with one another in a voluntary manner. It doesn't have to be defined by a state or a border.
Exactly. Well, that's kind of the problem, is that even our vocabulary to talk about it has been confused. So that when we say nation, people are going to think the state.
So, I always ask, what is the anarchist solution to a situation like what you see in Europe, in which there is a clear effort to, the way to put it, to kind of dilute the populations of Europe to create a monoculture under this European Union umbrella. They're weaponizing immigration in a sense. They're using it to further their end. What is an anarchist, voluntarist, free market approach to something like that? Because again, you get this conservative backlash that is argues to restrict immigration or to throw them out of the country or whatever.
So you see, that's exactly right. It's a pincher movement, and this is something I talked about specifically. I did an editorial a long time ago called "How to Really Defeat Globalism," and that editorial posits that you have obviously the sort of regional government and globalist forces that are trying to create larger and larger institutions that are further and further detached from people. So the answer to that must be national sovereignty in the nation state, and well, we must have power closer to home in Washington or Westminster or wherever the capital is, right? That's the way to solve this problem. And no, all that is changing is that they're going from a system of nation state sovereignty to a system of international institutions. All they're doing is saying worship this flag, and then they change the flag, and it's now a EU flag or a UN flag or something. Now worship this flag, and as long as you're worshiping a flag, you lose. They've gotten you into their spell. The real thing is to say, no, I'm not going to worship that flag or that flag. You reject both the national, we have sovereignty because we give our power to the president or something, and you reject, you have to reject the idea of giving away your individual sovereignty altogether. If you don't do that, it is not anarchy, it is not voluntarism, it does not adhere to principle. So I understand the practical and pragmatic, you're not being pragmatic, you've got to be more, you got to work with what reality is and all this. Yeah, okay, I get that. And if people want to play the political game to try to, at least it's better if it's closer and so we have more control over it than if it's some big EU structure or something. Yeah, I get that at a practical level, but ultimately that's not the anarchist solution. And I think you're never going to get to the anarchist solution from the political perspective. So
you don't think that someone like a Ron Paul is just kind of spinning their wheels?
Well, that's an interesting point, because what I appreciate about Ron Paul and what he's done is not at all anything to do with his record as a congressman. I'm a Canadian in Japan, so what do I care about American domestic politics?
I think he's the best record in Congress in congressional history.
He's
voted against everything.
Yeah, exactly. So voting against the government, I guess that's the only thing you can do morally. But I don't care about that. I care about the incredible awakening of millions of people to the philosophy of liberty that he's had. That is a legacy, and that means something, and that leads to things like where we're at here in Acapulco, and people all around the world have been touched by that. That is important. The political stuff, yeah, okay, I get it. That's a game.
Right, and I think like Ron Paul utilized this. My view on this is this: we're in the matrix. We have the paradigm that we have, and we all, not we all, obviously people in our community are in agreement about a lot of things. But I think that like somebody like Ron Paul, he was able to bring these concepts to people that if we were just like, I don't know, like an overt, just off the rip anarchist, a lot of people would be closed off to. Like his contribution has, even if it hasn't brought people all the way, it has definitely. This pendulum has swung at least ever so slightly towards a consciousness that advocates and values freedom and liberty over. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, you raise a good point, and actually, let's end on this point because I got to get going. But you raise the point that he doesn't look like a crazy anarchist and doesn't have tattoos and whatever. He's a straight-laced grandpa kind of figure. And so speaks to a completely different audience in a completely different way than other people would speak to him. But that's the great thing about this. The thing about a movement that actually is growing and actually will reach the maximum number of people is that, there are a million different types of people that communicate in a million different ways that will reach completely different people in different times. And the beauty is to have that all. I don't want this or that. We don't have to do that approach or that approach or that approach. We can, yes, let's do it all in any way you can. And that's always my message to people out there. I always say, I'm really no one special. I've had zero training of any sort to do what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway. I don't care. I don't need your permission. If you can help support me with some money, that would really help. But I'm just going to do what I do in the way that I do it, and it will resonate with some people. Some people love my style. Some people hate my style. I'm just me, and all I can do is express myself. If you don't like what I do or the way that I do it, I encourage you to go out there and do it yourself. It doesn't have to be a podcast. Some people can do podcasts. Other people are artists, musicians, businessmen, whatever it is, whatever you are, there is a way to spread the message of freedom and liberty. And my answer to it, to anyone asking, should I do this, should I do that, is just yes. Just do it.
So what do you know? A decentralized solution to anarchy.
Yeah.
James, thank you so much.
All right.
Write your congressman. Sorry, I was just reminded. Come to Anarchadelphia this year. We're having it again. It's on these dates. show up. It's going to be awesome. Last year was great. Thanks, James. I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
I believe that only individuals have rights, not the collective group. That these rights are intrinsic to each individual, not granted by the state. For if the state has the power to grant them, it also has the power to deny them. And that is incompatible with personal liberty.